In the boundless theater of the American West, where the wind howled through canyons like a chorus of ancient spirits, and the frontier stretched like an open book written in blood and dust, one figure rises not as a villain, but as a contradiction. A man wrapped in charm rather than cruelty, mischief rather than malice. The word outlaw was once carved in cold stone, synonymous with savagery, lawlessness, and the unsmiling face of death. It conjured images of dusty saloons torn apart by pistol fire, of grim riders silhouetted against the sun, indifferent to justice or decency. But then came Butch Cassidy, and the myth began to bend. Don't forget to leave a like. It helps more legends like this ride into your feed. Comment below the city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far the trail of Butch Cassidy still reaches around the world. And of course, partner, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story from the edge of history. He was a paradox in boots and spurs. Where others reveled in menace, Butch grinned, and what a grin it was, wide, infectious, disarming. Legends say it could melt suspicion and win hearts faster than a revolver could clear leather. In a time when outlaws were feared and hated, Butch Cassidy was admired. He didn't just defy the law, he defied expectation, and in doing so, he rewrote the very nature of what it meant to be an outlaw in the twilight of the American frontier. Butch wasn't some faceless brute who lived only to steal and shoot. He was welcomed into drawing rooms, laughed with lawyers and ranchers, exchanged nods with bankers who would later fall victim to his cunning schemes. He was a man of two worlds, one foot in the rough hide of the Old West, the other polished enough to move through the parlors and social gatherings of frontier elites. In another life, he might have been a mayor, a businessman, a statesman. But in this one, he chose something wilder, not because he was evil, but because he was free. To understand the man, you must first know the boy. Born Robert Leroy Parker on April 13, 1866, in the humble Mormon settlement of Beaver, Utah, the child who would one day become Butch Cassidy opened his eyes to a world brimming with hardship and hope in equal measure. His parents, Maximilian and Ann Parker, were British-born converts to the Mormon faith, seeking Zion in the rocky silence of the American West. They were dreamers, pioneers, builders of a new life from sagebrush and sweat, and young Robert was their firstborn, expected to lead by example, to plow the hard earth with discipline and faith. But the soil was unforgiving, and life in Circleville, where the Parkers moved in 1879, demanded more than piety. The land fought back. Every inch was a battle, and tensions soon rose, not just between settlers and the terrain, but within the social order itself. The Parkers, despite their diligence, found themselves on the wrong side of a land dispute, one that would become a crucible for young Robert's worldview. The conflict landed in a Mormon church court, a tribunal of local ecclesiastical authority. The decision? Not in favor of the Parkers. According to family law, the local bishop had it out for Maximilian Parker, who was what some called a Jack Mormon, a believer in faith but not always its institutions. Around the family table, these perceived injustices were digested with every meal. The lesson for Robert was clear. Power was not always just, and the system could betray even the righteous. In those formative years, as trust in structured authority began to crumble, the boy looked elsewhere for guidance, and into his life rode a figure as enigmatic as the wind itself, Mike Cassidy. A seasoned outlaw and drifter, Mike was the embodiment of the other path, the road not taken by most but deeply alluring to the restless soul. He took young Robert under his wing, not merely as a mentor, but as a blueprint for defiance. From Mike, the boy learned how to ride not just well, but like lightning. He became an artist on horseback, able to gallop around a tree at full speed and empty a revolver into a 3-inch knot of wood without missing a single shot. These were not the skills of a farmer's son. They were the tools of a ghost who could vanish into the hills and reappear 100 miles away with a grin and a saddlebag full of stories and gold. More than skills, though, Mike Cassidy gave him a name, or at least the first half of one. Years later, when Robert Parker would need to disappear behind a new identity, he wouldn't choose something forgettable. He would choose Cassidy in honor of the man who first showed him that life didn't and have to be lived under someone else's thumb. But Robert was not yet Butch. That transformation would come later, forged in the fires of lost dreams and whispered promises. For now, he was a boy with wild eyes and a growing taste for something more. More than farming, more than prayer, more than poverty. The world beyond Circleville called to him like thunder in the distance. He became a ranch hand, then a cowboy, drifting from Utah to Wyoming and back again, trading labor for food and knowledge. He developed a reputation for being hard-working, reliable, even likable, all while quietly building a second self, one who would no longer bow to anyone else's rules. The days were long, the wages meager, but something about the open plains suited him. It gave his dreams room to breathe. In those early jobs, Cassidy mastered horses, roped cattle, and read the land like a second language. But he was also studying people, watching how the wealthy twisted laws to suit themselves, how power protected itself behind church walls and courthouse doors. He wasn't bitter yet, but the seed had been planted. In this crucible of sweat, injustice, and outlaw mentorship, the legend of Butch Cassidy began to simmer, quietly but undeniably. He would not be a murderer. He would not be cruel. But he would never again be small. He would never live on his knees. And when the moment came to choose between the slow death of honest poverty and the dangerous freedom of outlawry, he chose the saddle, the six-shooter, and the storm. Thus began the making of a man who would charm a nation while robbing its trains, and rewrite the legacy of the outlaw, not as a villain, but as a rebel with a code and a cause. Beneath the shadow of the Rockies, in a land where fortune glittered in the streambeds and bullets stitched the night, a young man named Robert Leroy Parker stepped into the crucible of the West, not as a legend yet, but as a restless soul teetering on the edge of transformation. The frontier was not a place of peace, it was a forge, and in its fires men were either broken or reborn. It was in Telluride, Colorado, that the boy who would become Butch Cassidy first heard the call of crime. Not as a whisper, but as a thunderous declaration. Telluride was a mining town built on ambition and held together by vice. The smell of dynamite and silver hung in the air like prophecy. Gambling halls echoed with laughter, gunshots, and the seductive songs of dance hall girls who knew the scent of desperation better than perfume. And amid all this chaos stood young Parker, wide-eyed, drawn not to the danger, but to the freedom, to the chaos with rules of its own. He began, innocently enough, as many young men did, hauling ore, racing horses, trading sweat for coin. But Parker wasn't wired for monotony. He had speed in his veins and a gambler's gleam in his eye. And in the racing circles of Utah and Colorado, he found both money and identity. Horse racing in the West wasn't just entertainment, it was status, reputation, and the perfect training ground for a man who would soon need to outrun the law. But racing didn't fill his pockets the way silver did for the miners, or the way a bank might for someone bold enough to try. In the year 1889, alongside future Wild Bunch members Matt Warner and Tom McCarty, Parker made a choice that would divide his life like a blade through canvas. They robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride. It was clean, swift, a plan executed with military precision and cowboy bravado. It was here truly that Robert Parker died and Butch Cassidy emerged. The name was no accident. Cassidy was taken in honor of Mike Cassidy, his early mentor and outlaw role model, a man who showed him that rebellion could wear a smile. Butch, on the other hand, came from an unremarkable stint working as a butcher's assistant in Rock Springs, Wyoming, but like many details in the Cassidy mythos, even the mundane was reimagined. Butch sounded sharp, punchy, like a fist wrapped in charm. After Telluride, Butch did something curious. He didn't dive headfirst into a life of crime. He vanished for a time, laying low on ranches across the high plains. He worked. He lived simply. He earned the respect of honest men, even as he quietly plotted his next move. Those who knew him during this time spoke of his good nature, strong work ethic, and undeniable charisma. He was the kind of man you'd want riding beside you at dawn or watching your back in a bar fight. And yet, beneath the surface, something was brewing. A philosophy was forming, not written in books, but chiseled into him by injustice and observation. The cattle barons who ruled the land with money and might had begun fencing off open ranges, claiming water rights, crushing small ranches beneath a gavel made of gold. Homesteaders suffered. Land disappeared. Livelihoods eroded under the weight of monopoly. To the barons, unbranded cattle were theirs by divine right, but to men like Butch, that was theft disguised as law. So, when he rustled cattle, or more often, bought livestock from rustlers and failed to ask questions, it wasn't a crime in his mind. It was redistribution, resistance, retaliation. But the barons saw things differently. And when Cassidy unknowingly bought a stolen horse for $5, a trap laid by those with influence, he was arrested, convicted, sent to Wyoming State Prison for horse theft. 2 years behind bars for a crime most men would have walked away from with a warning. It wasn't justice, it was punishment for defiance. In the stony silence of his cell, Butch Cassidy did not break. He plotted. He transformed. He left prison after 18 months not broken but sharpened. His charm was still intact, his humor still warm, but now there was steel beneath the grin. No more drifting, no more doubt. He would build an empire, not with votes or land deeds, but with guns, grit, and brains. And so he did. He began to gather a crew, not just thugs or shootists, but professionals, men with talents, skills, loyalties forged on the trail and in the fire of desperation. His first and perhaps most loyal companion was L.Z. Lay, a man as principled as he was dangerous. Then came Harvey Logan, the infamous Kid Curry, a man whose temper was legend and whose trigger was a whisper away from war. And finally, the most iconic pairing in outlaw lore, Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, an expert marksman with eyes like flint and a heart that beat only for action, and Etta Place, the mysterious woman who would follow them to the ends of the earth. Together, they would form the Wild Bunch. This wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. It was a syndicate. A mobile operation run with precision, vision, and moral codes that defied both civilization and savagery. Butch expected discipline, strategy, and above all, non-violence whenever possible. Guns were tools, not toys. Death was not the objective. Escape was. Every heist was an operation. Relay stations with fresh horses, pre-scouted escape routes, plans within plans. Cassidy elevated outlawry to a high art, a dance across the edge of legality and survival, choreographed in dust and thunder. The Wild Bunch was more than a name, it was a philosophy, an open challenge to the titans of industry, the banks, the railroads, and the cattle empires that had turned the West into a gilded cage. They struck the arteries of power, not the poor. They stole from the men who wore silk gloves and wielded iron fists. In return, they were hunted like wolves. But as their fame grew, so too did their legend. They weren't just outlaws. They were folk heroes. They moved with purpose, struck with efficiency, and vanished into the canyons like shadows. The law couldn't catch them. The railroads couldn't stop them. And the people, many of whom had been ground down by the same system the Wild Bunch defied, cheered them on in whispers. It had begun with a bank in Telluride. It had evolved into a campaign of calculated rebellion. And Butch Cassidy, charming, cunning, and unshakably loyal, rode at the center of it all. Not as a brute, not as a villain, but as the last great outlaw of the American West. In the myth-soaked expanse of the American frontier, where law rode on horseback and justice often came late, if at all, the West became a theater of survival. Among its most riveting players, none loomed larger than Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, a collective not of madmen or mindless thugs, but of calculated outlaws, deadly artisans, and loyal revolutionaries who followed a man with vision and charm to match his cunning. If Butch was the architect, the soul, then his crew were the moving parts of a living machine designed to defy the mighty and steal with method. Kid Curry, born Harvey Logan, was the storm in the gang's sky. Where Butch was smooth and witty, Curry was volatile, brutal, and efficient. A gunfighter through and through. His reputation was painted in blood, earned through showdowns, shootouts, and the silent threat of a man who didn't hesitate. Feared across the West, Curry was often the last face a lawman ever saw, and though Butch loathed unnecessary violence, He knew there were moments when a man like Curry was the difference between freedom and a noose. If Curry was fire, the Sundance Kid, Harry Longabore, was ice. Quiet, reserved and deadly with a six-shooter, Sundance wasn't the type to boast. He spoke with bullets, his marksmanship unmatched, his movements smooth as smoke. Where Butch charmed crowds and Curry cleared bars, Sundance slipped through spaces like a shadow. He wasn't trying to be liked, but those who knew him respected the quiet control, the storm behind the stillness. By his side, a woman who would become one of the West's most enigmatic figures, Etta Place. Elegant, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, Etta defied every expectation of what a woman of the frontier was supposed to be. She could ride, she could shoot, and she could vanish just as easily as the rest of the wild bunch when the heat turned up. Some claimed she was a schoolteacher, others said a runaway aristocrat. All that's certain is that Etta Place was not an accessory. She was a partner, particularly to Sundance. Together, they were romantic legend and outlaw reality, a pairing that baffled authorities and captivated imaginations. What set the Wild Bunch apart from the average gang was not just their skill, it was Butch Cassidy's revolutionary approach to crime. He didn't see himself as a thug. He was a logistician, a tactician of the Old West. His robberies weren't chaotic lunges into danger. They were meticulously crafted heists, timed and executed like military operations. His greatest innovation: relay horses. Butch understood the land. He knew how far a horse could run at full tilt before fatigue set in, and more importantly, how to extend that range. Before any job, he'd pre-place fresh horses along planned escape routes like an outlaw pony express. While posses struggled on exhausted mounts, the Wild Bunch switched to fresh steeds and vanished into the horizon, always one gallop ahead of justice. One of their most famous robberies was the Montpelier Bank heist in Idaho. It was Cassidy's plan from top to bottom. Every move rehearsed, every detail considered. The gang struck quickly, with confidence and flair, then mounted their well-placed horses and rode out on a web of hidden trails and canyons. It wasn't brute force, it was precision larceny, and behind every robbery was an escape path woven into the fabric of the land itself. The Outlaw Trail. The Outlaw Trail wasn't a road, it was a network of hideouts, a constellation of rugged safe zones spread from Canada to Mexico, known only to outlaws and legends. For the Wild Bunch, it was a lifeline, a corridor of freedom amid pursuit, a place where time moved slower and the law could not follow. 3 sanctuaries stood out above all: Hole-in-the-Wall, Wyoming, a natural fortress. Towering cliffs, narrow entrances, and high ground made it virtually impenetrable. Here, Butch Cassidy even kept a ranch, a place to rest, plan, and remain unseen. Brown's Hole, Utah, a river valley where the states of Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado converged. The terrain itself was a tactical advantage. Lawmen could be spotted from miles away, and jurisdiction confusion let outlaws play one state against another. It was a chessboard where Butch always had the first move. Robber's Roost, Utah, the final veil. So remote, so hidden, that even seasoned trackers lost themselves. Few men dared enter, and even fewer returned. Here the Wild Bunch lived not like criminals, but like free men on borrowed time, sleeping beneath the stars, swapping tales by firelight, waiting for the next move. The Outlaw Trail was not just a means of escape, it was their world. It provided shelter, allies, restocking points, and most critically, time. Time to vanish, time to breathe, and time to plan what came next. It was a secret highway beneath the noses of the law, and the Wild Bunch owned it. But no story of that era would be complete without peeling back the mystery of the woman who vanished just as suddenly as she arrived. To speak of Etta Place is to speak of shadow and legend, for her life was a paradox, a woman more capable than many men, yet more unknown than any outlaw. She rode with the most dangerous men of the West, not as a tag-along but as a peer, and yet her origins are lost in fog. Was she a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, a runaway from high society, a woman burned by love and remade in fire? No one knows. But what the legends agree on is this: Etta Place was the soul of steel wrapped in velvet. Her romance with Sundance was more than infatuation. It was a bond forged in lawlessness and loyalty. She stood by him through every danger, through the wealth and squalor, all the way to South America. She rode into the wild when most women were taught to fear the horizon, and then she disappeared. Around 1907, just as Butch and Sundance resumed their outlaw operations in South America, Etta was gone. No record of her returning to the US, no grave, no final letter, just silence. Some say she died. Others claim she changed her name, started anew, or perhaps simply grew tired of the chase and left it behind. Whatever the truth, she remains one of the great unsolved riddles of the West. But what she represented endures. Etta Place was a symbol of rebellion, not just against law but against expectation. She defied the role society tried to script for her and instead chose the roar of the trail, the kiss of gunpowder, and the uncertain loyalty of love on the run. Together, Butch Cassidy, Kid Curry, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place carved their legend not with cruelty, but with wit, daring, and design. They robbed, yes, but they did so with the poetry of professionals, men and women who saw the system as broken and chose not to beg it for scraps, but to take what they could from its iron grip. They lived like phantoms, with the wind in their hair and the world at their heels. And though their trails eventually vanished, their legacy burns on, a reminder that even outlaws can be visionaries and even fugitives can be free. The legend of Butch Cassidy did not rise from obscurity by whispers or slow recollection. It erupted, suddenly and spectacularly, from the thunderclap of gunpowder and hooves pounding across western soil. He was not just an outlaw, he was an event, an echo, a name carried by the wind and feared by the rails. The robberies that followed the formation of the Wild Bunch weren't mere crimes. They were statements, masterpieces of disruption executed with flair, restraint, and above all, purpose. One of the most brazen of these operations unfolded at Castlegate, Utah, in 1897. There, Butch and his trusted men executed a bold daylight robbery of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company payroll. As the paymaster disembarked with a satchel full of workers' wages, Cassidy and Elsie Lay struck, cool, collected, unflinching. Before a crowd of stunned miners, the money was lifted, and the robbers were gone like smoke. It was robbery as performance art, honed to a razor-edge edge by Cassidy's unwavering belief in meticulous planning and clean escapes. These feats didn't just earn riches, they minted legends. The Wild Bunch became mythic, ghost-like figures that haunted the imaginations of townsfolk and lawmen alike. They weren't crude highwaymen or aimless killers. They were professionals, striking with near-military precision, disappearing without a trace. And at the center of it all was Butch Cassidy, charismatic, grinning, and increasingly perceived as something greater than an outlaw. He became what some historians would later call a social bandit, a figure who appeared to wage a war not on the people, but for them, targeting the rich institutions of the West, banks, railroads, and cattle barons. This Robin Hood illusion, though enduring, was never quite true. Butch did not rob the rich to give to the poor. He robbed the rich because he believed they were corrupt and because it was profitable. And while he occasionally shared his spoils with ranchers and homesteaders, he was no charitable savior. His generosity was strategic, his affability authentic, but his purpose was rooted in justice for himself and vengeance against a system that had tried to bury his family and his name. The myth of Robin Hood was a romantic veil. Butch Cassidy was something far more complex. Nowhere was his outlaw philosophy more evident than in the infamous Wilcox train robbery of 1899. It began, as always, with a plan. The gang halted a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Arizona, and made their way to the express car. Inside, a man named Ernest Woodcock refused to open the door. Defiant. Brave. He dared them to come in and get him. Butch's answer was as blunt as it was efficient. Dynamite. The blast tore through the car, flinging Woodcock across it like a rag doll. Butch's men poured in, but when Kid Curry raised his revolver to kill the stunned messenger for his resistance, Cassidy stopped him. He saw honor in Woodcock's courage, even if it defied him. This was not senseless violence. It was war, and in war there was room for honor. This moment, small and quiet amidst the noise, revealed everything about Butch's strange moral code. He would dynamite safes, derail trains, and rob banks, but he would not kill without cause. He would fight the system, but spare the innocent. The gang escaped Wilcox with over $30,000, leaving behind only a trail of confusion, shattered steel, and whispered awe. But even legends bleed under pressure, and as their success mounted, so too did the response. The railroads, their profits threatened, their pride wounded, declared a private war. They turned to the one organization more feared than the law itself, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Ruthless, resourceful, and relentless, the Pinkertons assembled specialized teams, outfitted with the latest technology of the age. They hunted with the tenacity of wolves and the bankroll of kings. Union Pacific raised the stakes even further. They introduced a mobile task force complete with a pursuit train, armed with elite sharpshooters, horse stalls, food supplies, and communication tools. The West was no longer vast enough to hide the Wild Bunch. The hunt had entered a new age. For a time, Butch tried diplomacy. Tired of the chase, aware of the shifting world around him, he attempted to negotiate peace. Through his old acquaintance and loyal attorney Douglas Preston, he sought a meeting with representatives from Union Pacific. Cassidy offered a deal. In exchange for amnesty, he would end his criminal campaign, leave the life behind, and disappear for good. But the meeting never happened, not the way it was supposed to. Cassidy arrived at the rendezvous point early. He waited and waited. The railroad men and Preston were delayed, caught behind the very machinery of the West. Butch was trying to make peace with. Hours passed. The sun began to fall. And Butch, increasingly paranoid, wrote a note, left it beneath a rock, and rode off with a bitter taste in his mouth. "Damn you, Preston," he wrote. "You double-crossed me." To Cassidy, the failed meeting confirmed what he already feared. There was no place for a man like him in this world anymore. There would be no mercy, no truce. The machinery of power was too vast, too cold. The outlaw path was no longer a choice. It was all that remained. The grinning renegade returned to the trail, but now there was something darker in his gaze. And outside of Cassidy's mind, the world was changing fast. The Old West was crumbling beneath the iron weight of modernization. Telegraph lines carved through valleys like veins of control. Trains ran faster, reached farther. Automobiles appeared on the dusty trails, and with them came speed and surveillance beyond anything the Wild Bunch had known. The Pinkertons no longer relied on wanted posters. They had networks, technology, and a nation's worth of railroads behind them. There was no more space for romantic outlaws. The walls of time itself were closing in. Butch saw it, and he understood. The age of cowboys was ending. The land was being divided, fenced, and owned. The same forces that had squeezed his family in Circleville were now squeezing the very soul of the West. There was no frontier left to run to, unless it was across the sea. So he hatched a plan. But escape required money, and money required one last string of heists. In 1900, Cassidy led the Wild Bunch into Tipton, Wyoming, and struck with his usual brilliance. Then came the Winnemucca, Nevada bank job, executed cleanly, leaving behind only hoofprints and smoke. These robberies were not only about money, they were final performances, and they funded the future, a quiet exile in the Southern Hemisphere, a rebirth in Patagonia. But as always, the past reached out. In Fort Worth, Texas, the gang made one fatal error. Dressed in fine suits, full of pride and daring, they posed for a group photograph. Cassidy, Sundance, Kid Curry, Ben Kilpatrick, and Bill Carver stood in elegant defiance, a snapshot of infamy. The photo, proudly displayed by the studio, was seen by a lawman and quickly made its way to the Pinkertons. The Wild Bunch had finally given their faces to the world. Wanted posters exploded across the West. Every train station, sheriff's office, and hotel lobby bore their likenesses. There was nowhere left to hide. The heat intensified. The walls closed further. And so, with the last coins of outlawry jingling in their saddlebags, Cassidy, Sundance, and Etta Place vanished into the ocean spray, bound for South America, for a ranch in the wind-carved plains of Argentina, for a new beginning. But the outlaw trail they left behind would never be forgotten. Not by the lawmen who hunted them, not by the people who whispered their names like legends, and not by the West itself, which, in its final days of freedom, had known the touch of men who did not beg or break, but defied until the last ride. They crossed the equator not as fugitives, but as pioneers of a new chapter, a final gamble for freedom on untamed ground. It was February 20th, 1901, when the steamer cut through the waves into Buenos Aires harbor, carrying three unlikely travelers: Butch Cassidy, the notorious mastermind; the Sundance Kid, sharp-eyed and silent; and Etta Place, the enigmatic woman whose heart was as fierce as any man's trigger finger. They did not arrive in shame or fear. They arrived with money, ambition, and the illusion of reinvention. Argentina in the early 20th century was itself a frontier, a mirror of the American West a generation before. The great pampas stretched endlessly toward the mountains, offering promise, mystery, and isolation. It was a land of vast estancias, winds that whispered secrets in Spanish, and cattle herds that moved like ocean tides across the plains. To men like Butch and Sundance, it was a second chance in a world still unclaimed by the machines of industry and the eyes of the law. They purchased a ranch in Cholilla, a remote and hauntingly beautiful region nestled against the foothills of the Andes. The money from their final heists in the United States, the Tipton and Winnemucca jobs, funded this new life. The land was fertile. The cattle grazed peacefully. For a time, it seemed as though their story would end not in gunfire, but in quiet sunsets over Patagonia. Cassidy took to ranching with surprising sincerity, investing in fences, supplies, and livestock. Locals came to know him as James Santiago Brown, a quiet yet charismatic foreigner with a sharp wit and a gentle hand. They hosted guests, paid their taxes, and kept to themselves. Etta, graceful and sharp-eyed, rode alongside the men like she'd been born in the saddle. Fluent in Spanish, polite with neighbors, but always armed with a knowing gaze, she was both an ornament and a shield to the pair. To the people of Cholilla, the trio were simply Americans who had brought their own frontier westward. Pioneers, perhaps, maybe nobility in exile. But shadows are persistent things, and the past does not forget. Though the ranch brought peace, it brought no absolution. The Pinkertons, never far behind, had caught wind of their South American exile. The infamous Fort Worth photo had made its rounds. Rumors drifted southward with alarming clarity. Butch and Sundance began to notice it. The way strangers looked at them too long in town, the way questions were asked twice, the sense that a noose was slowly being woven just beyond the horizon. And so, as the law encroached again upon their fragile Eden, the old instincts returned. The rifles were cleaned, horses were reshod. The men who had sought a life of honest labor found themselves once again wearing bandanas over their faces, this time in a different language, under different stars. The robberies resumed. They began with gold shipments, gleaming caravans of wealth from the mines of Patagonia and Bolivia. The strikes were surgical, carried out with the same precision that had made the Wild Bunch legendary in the United States. Payroll wagons disappeared into the mountain mist. Trains halted under moonlight, stripped of their treasure by phantoms on horseback. The newspapers of Buenos Aires and La Paz began reporting bandido Yankees, armed, professional, and elusive. The whispers of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid found fertile ground in South America. Their legend had followed them across oceans and taken root in a new soil. They operated across borders, becoming nomads once again. One week in the foothills of the Andes, the next in the Bolivian Altiplano. They robbed not to grow rich but to survive, and perhaps to feel alive in a world that had tried to write their final chapters without permission. But it wasn't all blood and gold. There were still quiet nights on the ranch. There was still laughter. And in the center of it all, Etta Place, the woman who had followed two outlaws into exile and become something more than myth. Etta remains one of the greatest enigmas of the western frontier, American or otherwise. Tall, striking, and composed, she was as adept with a pistol as she was with Spanish and French. She rode with the men, lived with them, and, by all accounts, loved Sundance deeply. But no records of her background survive. No letters, no real name, no childhood stories. She appeared as suddenly as a storm and vanished just as mysteriously. In 1907, she was seen for the last time in Valparaiso, Chile, boarding a ship bound for the United States, alone. Some claim she returned to New York, others say San Francisco. Some suggest she sought a new life, perhaps under a different name. Perhaps she was tired of running, of hiding, of watching the men she loved drift deeper into violence and desperation. Perhaps she saw the end coming and chose a different road. From that point forward, Etta Place disappears from history. No death certificate, no marriage record, no confirmed sighting, only speculation. Some say she became a schoolteacher in the East. Others whisper she was a Pinkerton plant all along. A few believe she died in childbirth or illness shortly after returning. None can prove it. She became a ghost, a symbol of what the frontier devoured. Women with fire in their veins and no place to call home. For Butch and Sundance, her absence left a hole no robbery could fill. They pressed on without her, but the dynamic had changed. Where once there had been hope, now there was only the next job, the next safe house, the next desperate sunrise. The years that followed would see them chase and be chased, rob and retreat. No longer were they the grand strategists of the wild bunch. They were foreigners with bounty on their heads, hunted not only by North American detectives, but now by South American authorities as well. The rope was fraying, and they could feel it. Yet still, they rode. Still, they laughed. Still, they believed they could outpace the end. But with Etta gone, the legend began to lose its glow. The last traces of domestic peace had vanished with her. The ranch faded into memory, sold off or abandoned. There were no more evenings by the fire, no more whispered promises of a new life. Only the hard, lonely gallop toward a fate they could feel in their bones. And as they rode into Bolivia, harder, higher, wilder than any country they'd yet known, some say Butch grew more quiet. Some say Sundance smiled less. The gold was still heavy in their saddlebags, but the future grew lighter each day. There was no going back, no surrender, no safe harbor. There was only the trail and the myth. The trail narrowed in Bolivia, and the wind that once carried legends now howled with finality. The year was 1908, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were no longer phantoms, no longer whispers on the plains, but hunted men tracked across the Altiplano like wounded wolves. The world had grown smaller, their routes had grown shorter, and somewhere in the dry red dust of the Bolivian highlands, fate was waiting. In early November, 2 masked bandits ambushed a payroll mule train, carrying wages from a remote mining concern. It was a simple job, bold in its clarity, executed with the calm precision of seasoned veterans. They made off with the gold and vanished into the dusty wilds, but it would be their last heist. The date was November 4th, and the target, a mining company near Tupiza, would be the final domino that brought decades of outlaw brilliance to a sudden, thunderous halt. The 2 men, identified only as foreign bandits, rode toward the obscure mining village of San Vicente, weary from the heist, weighed down by coin and exhaustion. The terrain offered no cover. The isolation that had once been their ally now exposed them. When they checked into a small boarding house, posing once more as mining officials or wandering ranchers, one of the locals grew suspicious. It wasn't their accents nor their behavior, but something much simpler. A mule. A recognizable one. A pack animal previously stolen in another robbery weeks earlier. The hotel's owner, who also happened to be the local corregidor, quietly slipped away and alerted a detachment of Bolivian cavalry camped nearby. The trap was set. That night, soldiers surrounded the adobe compound. They shouted orders into the darkness, demanding the surrender of the 2 Yankees inside. But the Americans were not made for surrender. As the first shots rang out, the quiet village of San Vicente became the final theater of the Wild West. Rifles cracked through the Bolivian night. Dust exploded from crumbling walls. Inside the shack, Butch and Sundance returned fire with practiced calm. It was not a long battle, but it was desperate. Sundance, ever the protector, made a run for extra ammunition across the courtyard. Bullets caught him mid-stride, and he dropped, hard, hitting the ground with final weight. Butch dragged him back, bloody, maybe dead, maybe not. We will never truly know. Then came silence. A final shot echoed from within the building, then no more. When the soldiers cautiously entered at dawn, they found 2 dead men, one with a bullet to the head, the other riddled with wounds. The official version claimed that Butch Cassidy had shot his partner to spare him capture, then turned the gun on himself. But this story, so cinematic, so tragic, so neat, it never sat right. Immediately, questions began to rise like dust from the trail. No definitive identification was ever made. The Bolivian authorities never provided photographic proof. The bodies were buried hastily in unmarked graves. No fingerprints, no dental records, just rumors, just silence. Back in the United States, the legend refused to lie still. Some say Butch Cassidy didn't die in San Vicente. Some say he faked his death, using the chaos and language barrier of South America to vanish once more. Stories trickled in over the decades. Sightings in Montana, conversations in Oregon, a mysterious visitor to a family ranch in Utah. There were letters signed with familiar flourishes. A man matching Cassidy's description was even interviewed in Washington state in the 1920s, calm, older, full of stories only Butch would know. Even members of his family claimed to have seen him again. A nephew swore Butch came home, changed his name, and lived out his days peacefully. Another claimed that Butch was buried not in Bolivia, but in the hills outside of Price, Utah. A former Pinkerton agent admitted before his death that Cassidy had beat us all. Was it all fantasy? Or was the greatest escape in outlaw history one final twist from a man who had outwitted the law his entire life? As for Sundance, the mystery deepened even more. His story dissolved almost entirely after San Vicente. No verified remains, no final letter, just empty shadows. Some claimed he died in Bolivia. Others believed he returned to Pennsylvania, living in obscurity under another name. And Etta Place, she never resurfaced, never claimed a body, never wrote a word. She, too, became a ghost. So what are we left with? We are left with two figures, galloping eternally through time, wrapped in myth and misdirection. We are left with a final gunfight that may never have happened as told. We are left with a feeling, more than a fact, that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid chose their ending, shaped their fates like they shaped their robberies, with elegance, defiance, and just enough doubt to keep us wondering. History demands answers, but the West in all its wildness doesn't care for closure. And maybe that's the way Butch would have wanted it. He was never the fastest draw or the deadliest shot, but he was the cleverest, the most enduring, the most human. He was a man who challenged the powerful, lived free in an increasingly controlled world, and smiled even as the walls closed in. And whether he died in a Bolivian shack or under an assumed name on American soil, one truth remains unshakable. Butch Cassidy outlived the West. If this story moved you, if you felt the dust on your skin and the echoes of hoofbeats in your chest, don't forget to leave a like. It helps more legends like this ride into your feed. Comment below the city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far the trail of Butch Cassidy still reaches around the world. And of course, partner, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story from the edge of history. This is the West, and these are its ghosts. We'll see you on the next ride.